Hey friends, welcome back to another episode of Seed Talk with Lisa and Layne. Hey Layne.
How's it going?
It is going well. When the sun is shining, it doesn't really matter how cold it is. It makes it nice, doesn't it?
True, it really does.
So, friends, we're glad you've dropped in for yet another episode of Seed Talk. And before we get into our topic of the day, just want you to know that this podcast is made possible by thegardenersworkshop.com, where you can check it out and find all of the work that we're doing, from the resources and blogs and videos and our online garden shop. We have a lot of fun stuff over there. So remember to check that out. So, Layne, what are we going to talk about today?
Well, today we're going to be talking about a fun topic. I think this is a fun topic, and I think you do too, Lisa. And it's going to be cool flower successions. So, we just wanted to talk about some things that make a cool flower a good candidate to be succession planted in very early spring and possibly beyond that. So, we'll be talking about succession planting cool flowers in general, and then more specifically with a few different flower recommendations that we think are good ones for you to try.
Oh, that is a good one because, so often sometimes we find that we've gotten a little behind. And so
Yes.
sometimes this will help cover you for that too, right? So let's get started.
Let's. All right, Lisa. So before we get started, let's just remind everyone, what do we mean when we say succession planting?
Succession planting, I don't even know what the official definition of succession is, but in my mind, it means you're going to plant it more than once. It's not like you plant it one time a year and that's it and done. It's multiple plantings over a period of time.
Right. And it just extends your period of harvest or the period of time you're
Right.
enjoying those flowers out in the garden, even in a
Yeah,
home garden setting. And
exactly.
the success of cool flower successions can depend on the conditions where you live. So could you just describe our climate here in southeastern Virginia, just so people have some context when we're talking about these things?
Sure. So we are in winter hardiness zone 8A. So we do have cold winters, but not deep cold and not usually deep snow. And we historically go straight from like winter into warm, humid summers. Sometimes we'll get spring-like behavior, but we don't always. And then we have long, hot, humid summers and growing conditions.
So people that might be in a warmer climate even than us, they may have a shorter window where they can succession plant some of these cool
Yeah,
flowers. And then people that live in a cooler climate might have the opportunity to plant for longer than we do down here.
exactly.
And one of the classic cool flower successions is actually planting in fall if a flower is winter hardy in your zone, and then following it up with a very early spring planting.
Yes, and there's some that we do that with, and then even beyond that, which is what we're talking about today. So it's kind of perfect.
Yeah, exactly. And just as a reminder, when we refer to very early spring plantings, we're specifically talking about getting transplants into the ground 6 to 8 weeks before your last expected spring frost based on historical averages.
Right.
So, before we get into the specific flowers, what are the potential consequences of planting a cool flower too late?
Sure. So oftentimes, they aren't as well established when they actually start producing and sending up shoots of stems, and they don't get as tall. And then all of this stress on the plant trying to do everything at once quickly, much less in conditions that aren't their favorite, right? Hot and humid. So they may fall victim to disease and pests, and you just don't get the abundance from them. And they just are puny. When you
Yeah.
kind of skip that cool flower concept, is kind of what I call it. When you plant late and don't hit those cool planting times, you just start seeing all those issues that many of us thought we could never even grow those plants previously when we were planting at the wrong time.
Yeah. So you might see shorter stems, a little
Yeah.
bit worse stem quality overall. They might be more susceptible to pests and diseases because they're growing outside of their preferred conditions. And like you said, they might be less abundant overall in terms of flower production. So, what are some of the qualities that might make a cool flower a good candidate for succession planting beyond very early spring then?
So the ones that I have found that I can push planting again 3 to 4 weeks or so after the very early spring planting is the number one thing I look at is if it's a plant that has excellent stem length. So plants that are naturally really tall in my garden, straw flowers come in at 48 inches plus, when we very early spring plant them. So we know that normally their stem, even if it was half that, would still be very usable. And so having tall stems is the number one thing that I look at. And then you just have to try different varieties. Some just perform better or will perform as well into the heat and humidity where others won't. Straw flowers, we just have found we can just push them deep into the summer. Others, not quite so much. So you really have to test different types of flowers. And then within a flower, there are some varieties that do better than others.
So this is a good experiment to conduct for yourself to
Yep.
try planting another succession, possibly beyond very early spring, of some of your cool flower favorites and seeing how they perform. But if they tend to be plants that are already on the taller side, those are really good candidates. And if they're more heat tolerant, some of the cool flowers really dislike heat. And
Yeah.
those also tend to not perform as well planted well beyond the very early spring window.
Yes.
And a plant's sensitivity and response to day length is another thing to be aware of because it can have a really big influence on stem length.
And I will tell you that folks need to pay special attention seeing that beautiful Sweet William staring back at me. And remember, y'all, you can go over to YouTube and watch the video that goes with this podcast. And there's a great slideshow. But oftentimes it is very variety specific because so many often, and I'm thinking of one particular flower farm and friend would say to me, oh my gosh, we have never been able to succession plant Sweet William beyond fall and very early spring. Well, they in fact were planting the varieties that are notorious not good for that. Do you know what I mean? We
Yeah.
found that, Amazon is the one that it was hybridized to tolerate heat more. So, so there's more to the story sometimes. So it's worth experimenting.
So it depends on the flower, the variety, and then your growing conditions as well.
Exactly. And it's oftentimes very worth it.
It is. All right, so now we're going to move on to talking about some of the flowers we particularly recommend trying. These work well for us in our climate, and chances are they have a good chance of working for you too. So the first one that would have been on the list is Bupleurum rotundifolium, but we're actually not going to talk about Bupleurum today because back in episode 72, we went really in depth about how to grow Bupleurum, some germination tips, and how we recommend succession planting it. So go back and check out episode 72 if you want to hear about Bupleurum, but that definitely would have been on this list.
Right.
Okay, our next flower is going to be one of our favorites, and it's Feverfew, which is Tanacetum parthenium. Of course, it's these sprays of these adorable button-like blooms. Why is this something to plant in very early spring and beyond?
This is an excellent garden flower, but it is also a big part of our bouquet program. And what I've pretty much learned, whenever I say that was a great flower for bouquets, that usually means it was also popular with our florists because they found the very same thing was true for them. Feverfew, especially, I just love the single, which is on the slide on the right, the little daisy-like flower, is just a really casual, nice backdrop to all the other flowers. So we could use it as long as we could get it to bloom. And they get super tall normally. And so even
They
half as
do.
tall, they're still great.
Yeah, these get super tall in our garden as well. Are there any particular varieties that stand out to you as better for succession planting, or do you tend to do all of them?
Well, I would just say the three probably go to for me are the Vegmo single, which is the daisy-like flower. The strongest germinator of them although I will tell you that all the Vegmos this year have excellent germination, like 100%. They're so great. Is the white, isn't it White Wonder? Is that the name of it?
Tetra White
Yeah.
or Tetra White Wonder. Yeah.
Tetra White. They change the name about every 3 years for some odd reason. So
I
that
know.
one is the strongest germinator for you. That's the very first one I ever grew. That one is really great. And then we also really love the Vegmo. Is it Sunny Ball?
Yes.
Yes. So those three they kind of look different, distinctly different. So those are the three that we succession plant.
And how do your successions beyond very early spring, how do they seem to perform in terms of stem length and quality?
They do really great. So the height is more manageable, actually. They come in at about 24 to 30 inches instead of 36 to 48 inches because, the flower heads are multiple, like a little spray, and they get quite heavy. And so for me, they're even more, sometimes we don't even net those later plantings. Of course, it's crazy busy then, you're deep into the summer, June and July. And so we find that they just do really, really well. And they're very pest resistant anyway. So they do really well.
What succession interval do you tend to do, and how many times do you plant after very early spring? And then why do you stop?
Just one, usually about 6 weeks. We just get not tired of them, but there's just so much because we are big succession planters and we constantly have new stuff coming on. It's just time for something new. We move into later seasons. So we do it we plan to have another succession after very early spring, about 6 weeks or so. And if I don't remember whether feverfew is day length sensitive also.
Yeah, they are long day plants. So do all your plantings tend to truly bloom in succession?
I found that the fall and very early spring really do bloom quite closely together, almost at the same time, a little bit later. And then by stretching out that third succession, putting transplants in the ground about 6 weeks after very early spring, that stretches it out right far.
Okay, our next flower is going to be Strawflower, aka Xerochrysom bracteatum, although it does have some other botanical names that it's commonly listed as well. So why is Strawflower something to plant in very early spring and beyond?
So this is one that is technically supposed to be winter hardy here, but it's oftentimes iffy, and we have found it performs so well when it's very early spring planted. We just don't even waste the energy doing it in fall with that risk. So Bobo and I, 2 years ago, did a kind of, we can never have enough straw flowers. We love it for bouquets. Our customers love it, and we love it for drying, right? So you never have enough. So we decided to do multiple plantings, and we found that they do really, really well. And last year, we got straw flowers to bloom. I am going to guess and say, I think it was September. So we had it into fall. And so, but people love straw flowers. They love the fact that they can pull them out of a bouquet and stick them in a little vase and keep them forever dried, and they hold their color. And they just last a long time in fresh bouquets.
And if you get the right varieties, cut flower varieties, not bedding varieties, they can be so tall, which makes
Oh,
them a really great candidate. And they're native to Australia, so they really, really tolerate heat. And I use them a lot of times just out in the garden. And because those blooms are so papery, they last so long in the heat of the summer, even when you're not cutting them. So
exactly.
they're just a great candidate to succession plant. So how does Strawflower perform beyond very early spring in terms of the stem length and the overall quality?
Yeah, so you mentioning that they are native to Australia explains why they're so heat and drought tolerant, right?
Yeah.
They just go, go, go. I remember one particular patch, it wasn't last year, it was the year before. It was in a part of the garden that I would say is not the greatest soil that we have, and they were never really irrigated, hardly at all beyond getting established. And we still had just about chest high production out of them. So it has really great stem length. It may not produce as much regrowth late in the season, but it is definitely worth it. They just do really, really well. And I find I have so many little videos of tiny little native bees on these. They are really a
Oh,
favorite
yeah.
pollinators.
So what is your succession interval that you tend to do beyond very early spring? And how many times do you plant over the course of the growing season?
So we did them at 4 weeks, and we did a total of, including very early spring, a total of four. So, but then again, last year we did one even later than that. And, it's often we learn these things by hiccups. It's like all of a sudden we realize, you know what? We never did any additional successions of strawflowers. Wow, is it too late? I don't know. Let's find out. And so
Yeah.
Bobo started the mix and planted it. And sure enough, it was blooming right alongside our tuberoses and our hairy balls, which are later in the season. So,
Okay, now we're moving on to a really beautiful one, and this is going to be Sweet William, also known as Dianthus barbatus. And of course, this has these beautiful clusters of almost hydrangea-like
yes.
blooms. And certain varieties of this are better for succession planting than others, so we will definitely talk about that. But in general, why is this something to plant in very early spring and beyond?
So Sweet William is a incredibly high demand crop if you are selling commercially. And it's the opposite of what I mentioned earlier. And because it's so great for your florist, it's probably a great flower for you if you're selling also bouquets. This is a flower you often see in grocery store bouquets that are shipped in, and that's because they hold up so well, right? So they are really sturdy flowers, and they do very much resemble the heads of mop head hydrangeas.
They
Um,
do.
and so they're a great demand flower. They are long lasting. And once you figure out their conditions and when they occur in your garden and you plant them, you can sell them. I mean, we did. And we just loved having one stick of this. This is Amazon, and it has multiple little breaks in a stem. The breaks are those little miniature stems at the top that give you multiple flower heads, and they just really fill up a bouquet, and they're beautiful colors.
They really are. So some varieties of Sweet William, like Electron, are true biennials that require vernalization or a cold period in order to bloom. So those are not good candidates for succession planting. And then even amongst first-year flowering varieties, some varieties tend to be shorter and less heat tolerant, which makes them perhaps not as good of candidates for these beyond very early spring successions.
Right.
So can you talk about which varieties tend to be the best for succession planting beyond very early spring?
Sure. So I find that the series, which is called Amazon, has the best opportunities for succession planting because it was, in fact, I guess it was new on the market 10 years ago. It was came out maybe a little earlier than that. And part of its characteristics was that it was a little bit more heat tolerant. So it was hybridized with that in mind, right? And we get great, especially if you irrigate it once it starts to heat up a little bit outside, we get great stem length, not as much. I mean, we'll get, 36 inches or inch stems from these fall and very early spring. They can be a little shorter later on, but they're still definitely worth it. And it's because they go from seed to bloom in about 16 weeks or so. They aren't so day length sensitive versus that variety sweet, which is an early bloomer. That blooms when we fall plant it. It is one of the very first flowers to bloom. And I suspect that's triggered by the short days. And so if you plant that later in the season, it doesn't have time to grow any length before it starts setting bud. And then there's also those Sweet Williams, which are true biennials, that need vernalization that really are not candidates at all for, succession
Right.
planting. So the bottom line is this, to clear the cloud, is Amazon is the only one of the Sweet Williams that I attempt succession planting with.
And we actually did a really great comparison, an in-depth comparison of the Amazon and Sweet series. And that was back in episode 50, if anyone wants to go back and listen to that. And I also just wanted to mention that Sweet William is also really useful because it has such a long window of harvest, and you can actually use it before it has even bloomed.
Yes, that's a great point, Layne. Especially early in the season, if you're lacking other greenery, we cut Sweet William if the head size has any head size to it, and the buds don't even show yet. It's just like a green fuzzy stem. That
Yeah.
is really useful in a bouquet.
So what succession interval do you do? How many times do you plant? And then why do you ultimately stop?
Yeah, so why we ultimately stop is that people are ready for summer flowers. Now, if I was primarily serving just florist, there is definitely value. They would buy a Sweet William stem just like a Snapdragon. As you have them and they're good quality, they're going to buy them. But for us in the markets that we've served in recent years, which is direct to our retail customers, they really appreciate the ebb and flow of seasons. And so we plant Sweet William, Amazon, in the fall, in very early spring, and then typically one more time after that. In fact, we just wrote it on the calendar today to start it at the end of February, which means it'll be ready to go in the ground at the end of March or so, which is about 6 weeks after our very early spring. And, again, all it takes is for us to have a really hot, dry run on the early season, and it won't do very well. And we have just found it's better for us to invest our resources of time and energy in those things that we're pretty sure we're going to reap, when they actually come to abundance, and pushing cool flowers into heat or pushing heated flowers into cool has a risk. And I've just learned some are, I don't take many risks in business anyway. So, that's what makes us stop. So 3 times total, fall, very early spring, and then 6 weeks after very early spring for Amazon.
And embracing seasonality in general is just one of the fun parts about flowers.
It's so true. I mean, growing outside as I do and you do in a garden, that means what you see is what's happening outside. You know what I mean? There
Yeah.
isn't any buffer of growing in a hoop house or a greenhouse. And I think that people literally love that whole evolution through the season. I mean, we used to often say once the zinnias and the coxcombs start, people do not even want to see another snapdragon from me. They're done. They've been having snaps for 2 months, you know?
Yeah. And do all three plantings tend to truly bloom in succession?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. They're much more time than Feverfew is the one that overstretches her time. But Amazon sticks pretty true to that 4 months from seed to bloom.
Okay, now we're going to move on to pincushion flower, which is Scabiosa atropurpurea. And of course, this is such a great one because it has a really interesting appearance and lots of really fun colors,
Yes.
some colors that you might not expect in spring flowers also, which is always great. So why is Scabiosa something to plant in very early spring and beyond?
So this is another one that, it's just really great colors, like Layne said. I mean, who wouldn't want to have Fire King blooming wildly at 4th of July,
Oh,
We used to have cat fights here in the members only market for the Friday before 4th of July, people wanting red, white, and blue flowers, So the red of that scabby is just delicious, and the blue and the white. It's like it's patriotic all by itself. So that led us to once we've always fall planted it. We started very early spring planting it, and it did beautifully. And then we actually planted again to get some of these hot summer colors, not so much the Fata Morgan buttercream color, but the white and the blue and the red just really had great need in the summer. And they weren't nearly as tall, but they're over 60 inches sometimes when I fall plant them. So we have plenty of room to go down. So they provide properly, and they're just a great addition to summer bouquets.
I was just going to say the same as you. They get so tall that, again, that just makes them a really great candidate for succession planting.
Exactly. And abundant, we get so many stems. And so I wasn't really worried about those two common problems with bypassing the cool season planting era.
All right. And how does it perform in very early spring and beyond compared to your fall plantings?
They're still pretty ferociously tall. I still net them. And they still have an abundance of flowers. And so we tend to do it with the white, blue, and red. And then once 4th of July comes and goes, we're at, even if they might have some scragglers, we're very quick to extinguish them to get something else planted there. So yeah, they do well enough for sure.
And
Yeah.
then what is your succession interval and how many times do you ultimately end up planting?
Sure. So We do 3 times: fall, very early spring, and then 6 weeks later.
And do all the plantings actually end up blooming in succession?
They do, they behave.
All right, and our last flower is going to be black-eyed Susan or Rudbeckia hirta. This is just a beautiful one and it does really well in the heat. It starts blooming once the days are longer. And there's just so much variation amongst Rudbeckia varieties in terms of flower forms and colorations. So Lisa, why is Rudbeckia something to plant in very early spring and beyond?
So Rudbeckias, which are a big family of flowers for us, we love them, and there's a lot of different varieties, and we tend to grow on them all. We do fall plant them all, and that gets us the earliest blooms. And then we very early spring plant a couple of them that we like to grow, like Goldilocks and Indian Summer and Prairie Sun. And then to go beyond that, trying to get those darker faced Rudbeckias to bloom later in the season. And I have not done a deep enough experiment to actually give dates, but we need to find out when is the latest we can put them in the ground to get them to bloom, to try to get some of those late summer dark blooms like Denver Daisy and Sahara and Cherokee Sunset. How amazing would that be to have them in summer?
And how do the later successions perform in terms of stem length and overall quality?
Abundance was still great. We still had a lot of stems. And the stem length was not as strong as fall planted, but still strong enough. I mean, we had over 24 inches easily. And so they can fall victim to aphids, which may be more of a problem in the heat of summer. But other than that, they did great.
And then again, what is your succession interval and how many times did you plant in this experimental planting that you've been doing?
Sure. So we've done a total of 3: fall, very early spring, and then a planting 8 weeks later was the latest that we've done. Because black-eyed Susans, Rudbeckias tend to produce a lot of blooms, a lot of stems. Going any closer, any closer than 6 to 8 weeks, you would just be really covered up in Rudbeckia blooms. It'd be a lot of blooms to tend.
All right, well, that does it for this episode. So hopefully that helped give you all some pointers about some cool flowers that you might want to try to plant in very early spring, or if you already missed your window to plant in very early spring, you can still try to plant beyond that very early spring window. And we just want to remind you to please don't feel limited by this list. These are just some pointers. It's not all inclusive. And really the best way to find out what works in your area is for you to experiment yourself. So feel free, if you're over on YouTube, in the comments to share if there are any cool flowers that you really have had success planting beyond that very early spring window. Share what they are. And if you're listening in a podcast app, you can also let us know via the form linked in the show notes. But thank you so much to everyone for joining us again. And be sure to follow or subscribe wherever you're listening or watching so you don't miss any of our future episodes.
So thanks, Layne, for another great show, y'all. Isn't it just great to find out you can push the limits sometimes? And we're all still experimenting, right? So friends, remember, you can learn more about the work that we're doing over at thegardenersworkshop.com. And we hope to have you visit us over there, and you can stay kind of in the loop of what's happening at the Gardener's Workshop. All right, Layne, till we meet again. Ciao.
Bye.